The wars Trump promised to end are escalating. Why? When Donald Trump re-entered the White House, he did so with familiar firepower. Bold promises, strong rhetoric, and a vow to clean up the mess he believed his predecessor left behind. Among his loudest claims was a pledge to end two of the world's deadliest conflicts, the war in Ukraine and the ongoing devastation in Gaza. He declared he could stop the Ukraine war on day one. He insisted he would bring swift peace to the Middle East, claiming only he had the negotiating power to end the bloodshed. But 6 months into his presidency, those promises have not just fallen short. The conflicts have grown more intense. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza is now the worst in the region's recent history. Russia has launched its largest air attack since the start of the Ukraine war, and diplomacy, once fragile but active, has nearly collapsed. So, what exactly went wrong, and what can be done now? Peace is never simple. Trump is not the first U.S. president to learn the brutal lesson that ending wars is far more complicated than winning elections. In 1952, Dwight D. Eisenhower promised to end the Korean War. Once elected, he did go to Korea, but it took him 7 months and severe threats of escalation to push the warring sides to an armistice. That war has technically never ended. In 1968, Richard Nixon pledged a secret plan to bring peace with honor to Vietnam. Yet for much of his first term, the war intensified. The Paris Peace Accords didn't materialize until after his re-election in 1972. Barack Obama came into office criticizing the Iraq War and vowing to bring U.S. troops home. But his administration mostly followed the plan laid out by George Bush, a drawdown that was already in motion before he took office. Even Trump himself made grand promises in 2016, including a secret plan to defeat ISIS. In reality, he followed a modified version of Obama's strategy and declared success only by his third year. Gaza, a collapsing ceasefire and humanitarian crisis. Of all the situations Trump inherited, the Gaza conflict was perhaps the most diplomatically sensitive and the most promising. Before he took office, the Biden administration had negotiated a ceasefire and a hostage release agreement. Aid was flowing into Gaza, hostages were being released, and the violence had largely paused. But within weeks of Trump's return, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Trump dismantled key diplomatic structures, abolishing the U.S. Humanitarian Aid Coordinator and sidelining USAID's role in Gaza. The result? A 77-day aid blockade is leaving hospitals without supplies and civilians without food or water. International aid organizations struggled, and deaths from preventable causes surged. Meanwhile, ceasefire negotiations broke down completely. Hamas, battered but unrelenting, insisted on remaining in power as a condition for any long-term deal. Israel flatly refused, arguing that any outcome where Hamas remains in charge is unacceptable. The US, UK, and other allies echoed Israel's position, but offered little in terms of alternatives. This lack of a ZOPA, zone of possible agreement, meant talks stalled and then died. Hamas refused to transfer power to other Palestinian entities or international forces, and Israel refused to back down militarily. Even as the humanitarian crisis worsened, the Trump administration remained publicly silent for months. Only in the last few days, after mounting global pressure, has the White House agreed to support renewed UN-led aid deliveries. But for many on the ground, the damage is already done. Ukraine, mixed signals, and a strengthened Putin. In Ukraine, Trump's foreign policy has been marked by contradictions and uncertainty. When he took office, the Biden administration had already built strong coalitions with NATO allies and was steadily supplying Ukraine with military and financial aid. The strategy was not to win the war outright, but to strengthen Ukraine's position at the negotiating table and keep Russian aggression in check. Trump's initial actions disrupted that approach. In February, he publicly blamed Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, for prolonging the war. A month later, his administration pivoted and said the key to peace lay with Russia. Soon after, military aid to Ukraine was paused, triggering outrage among European allies and Ukrainian officials. Russia seized the opportunity. In the following weeks, Moscow launched its most aggressive air campaign since the war began. Civilian infrastructure was targeted. Power grids were destroyed. Thousands were displaced yet again. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Trump reversed his position. He promised increased military aid, but this time, funneled through NATO allies. He also threatened sanctions against countries purchasing Russian oil, including India and China. These sudden shifts may sound tough, but they've had one unintended consequence: confusion. European allies are unsure of the U.S. direction. Ukraine is unsure whether to trust continued support. And Putin, sensing inconsistency, has hardened his demands, pushing not just for territory, but for Ukraine's complete demilitarization. The absence of a clear and consistent U.S. strategy has given Russia time to regroup and expand its influence, just as Ukraine is struggling to hold the line. Diplomatic deadlocks. Why peace talks are failing. At the heart of both conflicts lies one common challenge: no zone of possible agreement. In Gaza, Hamas refuses to step down. Israel refuses to stop until Hamas is gone. Without a mutually acceptable outcome, negotiations are dead in the water. Even temporary ceasefires now depend on hostage swaps, short-term truces, and international mediation with no endgame. In Ukraine, the situation is similar. Russia wants to annex the occupied territory and permanently weaken Ukraine's military capacity. Ukraine, meanwhile, demands a full Russian withdrawal and wants NATO protection. There's simply no overlap. And without a credible, consistent U.S. diplomatic effort, one with leverage, leadership, and long-term goals, peace talks are destined to go nowhere. In the absence of real negotiation, both wars become wars of attrition. More violence, more suffering, less hope. Signs of a shift. Too late? In recent weeks, there have been signs that the Trump administration is trying to correct course. The president has pledged renewed support for Ukraine and made public threats of economic sanctions against countries fueling Russia's war economy. In Gaza, aid deliveries are slowly resuming after international condemnation reached a boiling point. But the damage from the early months of inconsistency may already be done. Trust among allies has weakened. The moral leadership America once held is being questioned, and both Hamas and Putin believe they can wait out U.S. pressure, because history has shown they often can. Whether this late shift in strategy is enough to turn the tide remains to be seen. But one thing is clear: if Trump wants to deliver on his promises of peace, he must act fast and stay consistent. What needs to happen now? In Gaza, the U.S. must refocus on humanitarian aid. The position of humanitarian coordinator should be restored. Aid must flow regardless of political calculations, and ceasefire negotiations must resume with clear goals and accountability on all sides. In Ukraine, the U.S. must follow through on sanctions, step up military support, and help NATO lead a unified front. Only with increased pressure and defensive strength can Ukraine negotiate from a position of power. And most importantly, America must speak with one voice. Flipping policies every few weeks sends the wrong signal, not just to adversaries, but to allies and the world. Conclusion: peace takes more than promises. Donald Trump came to power promising peace. 6 months later, both Gaza and Ukraine are in deeper crisis. But peace isn't made with tweets, speeches, or headlines. It requires strategy, patience, leverage, and leadership. Time is running out for diplomacy, for humanitarian relief, and for any realistic hope of de-escalation. The next 6 months may decide whether Trump's second term is remembered for peace or prolonged war.